Before we get started, I want you to know that our Coffee and Conversation Studio Open House is back on Saturday, September 20th, 2025. Running from 10 in the morning till about 1 p.m., we swing open the doors of our studio in Techtown for community conversation, coffee, and donuts, usually Dutch Girl donuts, to be specific. It's a great chance to meet up, talk about the show, the stories of the day, and meet other Detroiters and Metro Detroiters as well. I'll have a link in the show notes to Eventbrite, or you can search for us there, or send me a note, dailydetroit@gmail.com, and we'll be in touch. Hey everyone, and welcome to your Daily Detroit. It is Thursday, September 11th, 2025. Today, we're talking about the literal architecture of power in Detroit. We've got Andrew Lapin back with us. He's a journalist whose recent work with 99% Invisible on the Ambassador Bridge really gets into an important story about Detroit. It's a conversation about privatization, about legacy, and how decisions made generations ago are still shaping our lives today. We're going to be unpacking the historical baggage, the political machinations, and the almost unbelievable story of one family's grip on a vital piece of infrastructure. To me, it's a bit of a cautionary tale, but it's also a story about resilience, about what happens when a city starts to reclaim its narrative. Thanks to our members on Patreon for making this possible. Patreon.com/DailyDetroit. Feedback, as always, dailydetroit@gmail.com. Joining me at the studio at Techtown is someone I am very honored to return back to the studio, Andrew Lapin. He is a journalist and podcaster based out of Michigan and recently worked on a piece with 99% Invisible that I think is one of the best narrative podcast pieces about anything local that I've heard in a very long time about the Ambassador Bridge. We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more today on the show. Andrew Lapin, welcome back to Daily Detroit. It is good to see you. You haven't been here since the garage day.
I have not. It's great to be here, Jer. This has its own charm in Techtown. I also loved the garage, but congrats on stepping up and coming into a new space here.
Well, I appreciate that. And you know what? Congrats to you for always seeming to be on all kinds of different platforms. When we had you on before, we talked about an excellent miniseries that you did called Radioactive. It was about a radio priest in Royal Oak that really changed all of talk media, really laid the foundation for a lot of the kind of stuff we see in political talk radio that we see to this day. So go check that out. So knowing that your interest in powerful and I would say figures that are linchpins, why look at the Ambassador Bridge?
It's nice to hear my thematic interest kind of lined up like that, because sometimes I have to ask myself, in my head, it's like I'm interested in figures I see as ghosts of Detroit, sort of people in these mythic statures in the city who have caused a lot of mischief, maybe a lot of harm, but whose stories people don't tend to know. And I think this was a really good time to explore the story of the Ambassador Bridge more fully for a lot of reasons. One is that it's coming back in the news now with the Gordie Howe Bridge about to open. They had initially said later this year. I think now they're looking at next year. But then also with the renovation of Michigan Central, which we'll get into it, but both Michigan Central and the Ambassador Bridge share this DNA of ownership by the Maroon family. So the idea that the owner of the bridge, owned this bridge in the first place, that it is this privately owned major international bridge, but that he also owns hundreds of other properties across Detroit and Windsor, responsible for like a good portion of the blight that had plagued the city for decades. That really interested me, in being able to draw those connections back to characters or figures who have sort of been in the shadows. That was really appealing to me about digging into this latest story.
One of the things for me that made me think of, right, because I don't want to go into all the details of the piece, there's a few things that made me think of. One, how long this story has been going on. Those of us who have been around town for a while know that this bridge saga has years and years. And I realize with how many listeners are either new to the city and region or honestly new to the world. And I don't mean that in like a bad way, but I think about it. If you're 30 years old, you might not actually know all of the depth of this thing and how far it spanned back. So as a journalist and a reporter, how far back did you have to dig, and did anything surprise you in that?
Oh, yeah. I dug back all the way. I went back to the bridge's construction nearly a century ago. And that was actually the most exciting part because what I knew about the bridge growing up, my dad was a longtime urban planner in the city of Detroit. I would hear these stories about the Maroon family, Mattie Maroon specifically, just sort of being these barriers to progress in a more general way. But then, around 2012, with the ballot proposal, Proposal 6, that the Maroon family had backed that was, intended to try to block the construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge, I sort of had this realization of like, can you do that? Can you, you're just an individual person. You can raise all this money to force the state to vote on something that essentially benefits only you. And that's what sort of piqued my interest in the story of the bridge and in just how unusual of an arrangement it is. And so I went digging into several local historical archives, old newspaper clippings, because I wanted to know more about how it was that this was essentially, or one of the only, if not the only, privately owned international bridges in the country, and this one being so essential to the transnational economy. And how did it get like this? And I didn't have a good answer for that, which is why I was digging into it. So I learned a lot about the structure of the bridge, certainly.
Since I was there, I remember seeing the amount of political capital. I know he's a controversial figure to some, but former Governor Rick Snyder, who expended so much political capital, even against his own party, to make this happen, because it showed you the power of the influence of this much money, how people on both sides lined up in support. However they did in fact line up in support of this, and the amount of political capital that the governor had at the time to expend, having to work with the government of Canada. The government of Canada, basically, they paid for this thing, right?
They paid for the entire bridge. Yeah, for the Gordie Howe Bridge, which was conceived as really an attempt to break the monopoly of the Ambassador Bridge. And at first, there was going to be all these joint ownership arrangements. Michigan was going to pony up some of the money, but then those efforts kept getting blocked in Lansing. So Canada finally put out this offer that was impossible to refuse. They said, we will pay for the entire bridge. We will maintain it. Just please let us build it. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Rick Snyder played a really crucial role in getting the approval for the Gordie Howe Bridge past his own party, which sort of complicates his figure, in a lot of ways. But it also shows how deeply entrenched the sort of standard approach to dealing with this bridge was in state politics, that the Maroons just ran this thing and it was accepted that you had to deal with them if you were dealing in any way with the bridge or the neighborhoods around it. And the idea of building another bridge was for decades really just a pipe dream until Canada finally showed some muscle. I'm not criticizing Canada, but I'm just saying things got so bad that they had to step in and kind of do this thing and spend billions of dollars to build a new bridge right next to the old one. And now the Detroit skyline, you have these two bridges going to the same place. And as we say in the show, it's like one of them is there because of the stubbornness of the other.
It also strikes me that this whole story ties into Michigan Central as well. That is a project that has gotten international spotlight on Detroit because of, it was basically, just last night I was at the screening of a film called Resurgo by Stephen McGee. And one of the key points of it is he lives across from Michigan Central and documenting 6 years of turnaround of Michigan Central. I used to live in the site of Michigan Central myself. I remember I was around for when the Transformers movie was shooting there, and it was thought crazy that we can turn this thing around. And yet, once it left control of the Maroons, Ford picked it up, and now that is also moving. It feels like all these stories are all so tied together.
Absolutely. And that's what really intrigued me about this moment. It is a moment, as you're saying, this grander narrative of Detroit's recovery and economic forward thinking, these big infrastructure projects that are attracting a lot of positive attention. And then underneath that, it's also a story of Detroit moving on from the shadow of this one billionaire family whose politics and policies had been so protectionist for so long that they had really prevented this kind of thing from happening. And Michigan Central being for decades really the symbol, a bad symbol of kind of the quote unquote, ruin porn aspects of the city that, yeah, if you want to film a post-apocalyptic Transformers movie, that's where you go because it's already, it already looks like the way it did for so long. The idea that this was actually just one private owner who just didn't want to spend the money to improve it or whatever, that also really intrigued me about sort of linking these two stories. It really is this broader idea of a community and a city trying to move beyond the shadow of one wealthy industrialist family.
As a pundit who has been in the city and watched the city for a while, after I listened to your piece on 99% Invisible, I couldn't help but think, and I might expound on this more for an editorial, about the concept of momentum and how important it was to get momentum, because the bridge staying the situation it was and all the legal fights and all of the trying to make sure that progress of the Gordie Howe didn't happen. And then we could get into the neighborhoods where Canada is very upset. I've interviewed people at the Windsor Star about some of the issues that happened, over in Canada, the issues in Southwest Detroit that residents talk about, which you highlighted in this piece. The concept of momentum and how for so many years, decades, it wasn't just disinvestment, but every time it felt like in Detroit, we could get some momentum, do something good, a key piece would get in the way because somebody wanted to put a toll on it or get in the way of it or say, we're going to lock up 1,000 properties so that you can't do anything with them. We're going to hold it for a long time. That is the kind of thing that, as a longtime city resident, is extremely frustrating because, in my opinion, if not for so many instances of people locking up momentum, we could be so much further along in our Detroit story.
Absolutely. And I would say maybe slightly more optimistic thing that I learned reporting on the story was just how important, how crucial community development and local, hyper-local economic engines are to creating that kind of momentum. And that kind of work, again, can take decades. I mean, there have been people in Southwest Detroit trying to improve that neighborhood for very long time and kept getting stymied for years by the Maroons, but finally are at this moment where they can look at the situation and say, you know what, things are getting a little better now. And it's because of the community effort that was put in for all that time. Momentum doesn't just happen overnight. It's a very sort of complex, working of all these different factors that have to come together at exactly the right time.
How did it come that this piece became part of 99% Invisible, really giving it a national highlight on a platform that I think is well respected and also very thoughtful?
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'd been a fan of the show for a long time. I had profiled Roman Mars more than a decade ago when I worked for a media magazine, and he was crowdfunding his new show that became 99% Invisible. And I had this idea when I was really this is the time to do a deep dive into the Ambassador Bridge. I was like, what is the right audience for this? Because it is a piece of infrastructure. Maybe it's hard to get people to care about bridge ownership, bridge maintenance, whatever. But 99% Invisible, because it's a show that focuses so much on urbanism and design and the effects of design choices on public life, seemed like a really natural home for it. And so I really kind of blind pitched it, and I was very happy that they took me up on it, and the process of working with them was really incredible. And, they've done a lot of stuff about Detroit before. If there's a national media outlet that sort of gets all the struggles that Detroit has gone through relative to other cities, it's certainly this one. And so it was great to be able to share this with a broader national audience, because the Maroons had been these local notorious figures for a long time. But especially as we're talking as a country now much more about the effects of billionaires and quote unquote oligarchs on our economies and our livelihoods, this also felt like a good time to kind of reintroduce Matty Maroon to a new audience.
Yeah, and I got to say, Roman Mars was so kind with his time a few years ago to be on this show talking about his book, which I think it's its 5th anniversary now.
Yeah, and the show is celebrating its 15th anniversary as well. So it's a big moment for 99% Invisible.
So what is something, as you were reporting this out, because it really seems like you spent a lot of effort on this, what is something that you came in thinking that maybe you think different now?
When I was talking to folks in the know, a lot of them said, listen, it's very easy when you tell this story to just kind of paint the bridge's owners as villains, as sort of people who exist almost outside of space and time, and just you get rid of them and the problem's solved. That's not really the full story here. I think something that I came to learn is that, because Detroit is this city that has been very dependent on its billionaire class for a long time, within city government and elsewhere, there's this sense of separating the quote unquote, good billionaires, the ones like Dan Gilbert or, the Ford family who are willing to invest in the city, from quote unquote bad billionaires like the Maroons who seem to only be in it for themselves. But then really, when you get down to it, the issue is that this is a city that has become so dependent on a small handful of wealthy people in the first place for this kind of investment. And when you have a family that just doesn't feel like doing it, it creates all these problems that affect a lot of people.
I would also add historically, we're a company town. I mean, if you think about the impact of Henry Ford.
Absolutely.
And all of the projects that he just did or his family did, where it was just like Ford made it happen, throughout time. Or you think about General Motors, which wasn't one owner. It was more, General Motors history is more a stock held and it's a public company. But that would be the same thing. You think about the giant plants that happened, or even going back into history, you think about the Packard plant, which is now mostly demolished, but the impact that Packard had over blocks and blocks of the city's east side, you could go on where key parts of the city, and there's whole cities that exist only because of the automakers. You think about Highland Park couldn't have succeeded as its own city if not for the fact that Ford was there, right? And Ford was able to basically control a city that at the time at its peak had like 60,000 people in it, right? It's so dependent on these large automakers. And I think that even trickles down into our culture with a lot of people, not everyone, but like this whole startup technology, all that stuff. It's very new for Metro Detroit comparatively. Culturally, in a lot of ways, for a lot of people still, and I'll still hear it in my family, well, don't you want to go work for one of the big three? Like, why would you work for yourself kind of situation? That still exists here.
Totally, yeah. And we've seen many times in Detroit's history the consequences of relying too much on this one company. When it has spiraling fortunes, the city often follows. It's hard to recover from that. The Ambassador Bridge, being such a crucial linchpin of the auto industry specifically, has certainly played a role here. I mean, with plants being on both sides of the border, like the big three really needed the bridge for so long, and they had to be willing to sort of pay whatever tolls there were and just kind of deal with the situation as it existed, even though you would think that as these massive global economic engines, maybe they would have had the power to change something about it. But it really wasn't until, as we were saying, the governments of Michigan and Canada, et cetera, could get fully on board that actually there was a movement among the business class for a new bridge.
I even think about into the depths of Detroit history, in the early 1900s, there was actually a plan to put a subway down Woodward. You know who killed it? Verner's. Because one of the stops was going to be in front of their downtown shop. And he was on city council. And they killed the plan for a subway. So we would have had a subway if but for Verner's. Right. And so I always have a complicated relationship with the drink now as an urbanist.
you take a sip of the devil's ginger ale.
I do. It does help the tummy.
Yeah, no, it's delicious. And the prehistory of the bridge is similar. We sort of talk about in the show how it went to a vote because John W. Smith, I think the mayor of Detroit at the time, really didn't think it was a good idea to have a privately funded bridge that had no immediate plans to revert to public ownership. And so, this industrialist group that really wanted the bridge brought it to the whole city for a vote, and it passed overwhelmingly. People wanted this. They wanted this kind of bridge culture. There were all these real estate ads because people figured the communities by the bridge would become desirable places to live instead of what it is, which has become this war between the residents and the industrialists for control of those areas. People's priorities change over the generations. And as you know, it's very hard to be forward-thinking when you're making these kinds of decisions.
Oh, for sure. And I think some of that even permeates to this day because right now in Lansing, there's this whole fight about road money. Whatever you think about it, there's a fight about road money. And Michigan, historically, we've spent some money in Michigan with a bond project that the governor put together to pay for some road construction. But Michigan historically spends less than our neighbors on our roads, like our neighbors that have the same weather. We just spend less per person. And so we just don't get the same stuff as far as our roads. And so we often end up doing public-private partnerships to this day. And the bridge can be a cautionary tale around some of that because historically it's like, well, we want to keep our taxes lower. We don't want to spend as much on this. Well, the infrastructure still needs to get built. Somebody's going to build it.
Absolutely.
And the question becomes, do we want to step up and take the responsibility to do it? Or do we say, well, we didn't pay for it, and then you might end up with something like this bridge situation?
Yeah, and again, it's a hard thing to collectively get the entire, weight of a bureaucracy on top of. And with the bridge situation, it started out as essentially the city giving permission to private industry to build it. And then because of these financial quirks over the years, it wound up in the hands of one owner, which, it had been taken off the stock market to do that. And you could say the bridge's original funders maybe didn't intend for that to happen. And now suddenly, Detroit and Canada and all these entities have to deal just with like one person and their whims and their desires for profit in order to keep their communities running smoothly. It's these sort of downstream effects that really interested me that we can look at now because we have the power of a century of history to look at, but hopefully it can help inform some of these decisions in the future.
So what's next? Because this story is still kind of unfolding, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And, the piece for 99% Invisible had to be only around 35 minutes long. And so, people who have been following the story of the Maroons for a while, they'll see there's a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor, but I'm really hoping to do more on the story of the Maroons. I think there's a lot more to tell about certainly Detroit and Canada's relationships to the Ambassador Bridge, relationships to these kinds of big infrastructure projects. And so I'm hoping to keep pursuing this in some other long form venue. I would certainly invite any of your listeners who have stories they want to share about dealings with the Maroons, dealings with the bridge, or, with this new Gordie Howe Bridge coming up to drop me a line. There's a contact form on my website, andrewlapin.org. So I'm pursuing that, and I continue to work at my day job. I'm a reporter at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which is a Jewish newswire service. So for folks who listened to Radioactive and are wondering, what's the Shrine of the Little Flower up to now? Have they changed their approach to Father Coughlin? The answer is yes, and I've reported on some of that at JTA as well. So I would encourage you to seek that out.
And can you spell out that website for people to make sure they get it right?
Yeah, it's andrewlapin.org, ANDREWLAPIN.org.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you taking the time to come down to the studio at Techtown. I really appreciate this. And such great reporting. I'm so glad you shined a light on it, and I'm looking forward to what you do next.
Thanks so much, Jer. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to shows. And if you can, tell a friend about Daily Detroit. Word of mouth is the best way to push Detroit forward. Feedback, as always, dailydetroit@gmail.com or 313-789-3211. Devin O'Reilly will be in tomorrow. I'm Chair Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.